Okay, with a hush like that, I think it's time to begin. I'd like to acknowledge first that we meet tonight on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present, emerging and into the future generations. I would also like to pay a very particular welcome to Indigenous peoples collected here tonight to join us in a very important conversation around the incarceration of Indigenous peoples across the world, but also in our own country. So a warm welcome to you all and to our Indigenous peoples and leaders particularly. My name is Pip Nicholson. I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Law School, and it is, as I've just said, a particular pleasure to welcome the panel, our guest speaker, and the rest of you here this evening. I've got three things I want to do very briefly tonight. I want to introduce Eddie Cabillo, who is the person responsible for convening this discussion this evening. As I said at the outset, I really wanted to pay homage to Eddie Cabillo, who's the Senior Indigenous Fellow at the Melbourne Law School and who joined us in that role earlier this year. Eddie was instrumental in instigating and arranging for Dr Baz Dreisinger to visit us and also for coordinating the panel. Eddie will introduce the panel at a later point in time and will also chair your many and varied questions. Eddie comes from Larrakia, Wajigana and Central Arrernte country, so therefore from the Northern Territory. He completed a Bachelor's of Laws in 2002. He also holds a Master's and is well on the way to completing doctoral studies. Admitted as a practitioner of the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory, Eddie commenced work at Northern Territory Legal Aid Commission and has also worked for the Aboriginal Lands and Correctional Services Department of Justice of that territory. He served as the chair of the Atsik-Yiliyura Regional Council of the Northern Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency and is also chair of the was also the chair of the Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committee. In 2010, Eddie was appointed the Anti-Discrimination Commissioner of the Northern Territory and then as Executive Officer of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service. Eddie was announced, and he won't thank me for sharing this with you all, National Indigenous Legal Professional of the Year in 2015. The law school is very lucky to have Eddie working with it, albeit on a part-time basis, stewarding our students and our staff and broadening our cultural horizons and our breadth and depth of understanding of a very broad range of significant Indigenous issues. So, Eddie, I thank you and we welcome you and thank you for the stewardship of this evening. I might add, Eddie just said, just say one line, Pip, that's enough. So I don't think he's very grateful for my warm words of welcome, but thanks, Eddie, anyway. Then it is an extraordinary pleasure for me tonight to be able to introduce to you Dr Baz Dreisinger, who, as you all know, as you've come tonight to hear her, will focus on the global context of mass incarceration. And that, as foreshadowed, will be followed by a panel discussion on the endemic incarceration of Indigenous people in Australia. Before I invite Dr Dreisinger to deliver her lecture, I'd like to make a few remarks by way of introduction. Dr Dreisinger is a professor, journalist, justice worker, film and radio producer, cultural critic and activist, and wouldn't many of us like to have that many descriptors of ourselves. She is a professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City and is the founder of Prison to College Pipeline program, which offers college courses and re-entry planning to incarcerated men throughout New York State, and works broadly also to increase access to higher education for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. This movement has spread internationally, with programs being developed in South Africa, Ghana, Jamaica, Trinidad and the United Kingdom. Baz, if you'll excuse the informality, is Executive Director of the Incarceration Nations Network, a global network and think tank that supports and instigates and popularises innovative prison reform efforts around the globe. In 2016, Dr Baz authored Incarceration Nations, A Journey to Justice in Prisons Around the World. This is a first-person odyssey through prisons in 9 countries. In 2018, she was named Global Fulbright Scholar for her international work promoting education, not incarceration, and restorative justice internationally. We are extraordinarily fortunate this evening to have Dr Baz Dreisinger with us, and it gives me great pleasure indeed to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight. In New York, we give shout outs, so I'm going to give 2 shout outs. The first is to Eddie for, again, coordinating this and bringing this together through the fact that Eddie's childhood best mate read my book and years ago told me I must meet Eddie and I must go to Melbourne and connect with him. And so here I am. It's the beauty of the universe bringing us together. And I also want to give a shout out to Joe and Kurt from the Corey Courts, who were my wonderful hosts today and introduced me to that program. It was really meaningful. So there is a lot that I want to talk about tonight, but I also am very eager to shut up and listen because there's some incredible people in the room, and there's a lot that I'm eager to learn about. So what I'm excited to do tonight is do something that I haven't had a chance to do in a while, which is take this on in a new way. I'm accustomed to talking about my book, which is in many ways a chronicling of the problem, and tonight I'm here to talk about potential solutions. So when I first began working in prisons in the US about 16 years ago, a lot of people looked at me as if I were insane. And I began working in prisons there in the context of the Prison to College Pipeline program, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. It's essentially a university program inside prisons that also guarantees a place for people in university when they come home. So it's both a university program and a reentry program. And I started that program about a decade ago, and we've since flourished, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A as well. But initially, when I started the program, I heard a lot of comments along the lines of, are you crazy? Why are you educating those criminals? Why do they deserve an education? And what I noticed is that over the years, and especially in the past 4 to 5 years or so, I heard that a lot less. And people, when I said that I taught in prison and worked around prisons and around mass incarceration, there started to be a mainstream understanding in the US of why I was doing that and why lots of people were doing that. And that is because the issue of mass incarceration became recognized in the past maybe 5 years in the US as in many respects the civil rights issue of our time. And there were a lot of forces behind this, and again, we can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. Certainly books like The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, a film like 13th, all about the fact that essentially what mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow, is the new form of creating racial segregation in the US. And all of that started to become mainstream. There started to become a recognition that, for instance, and I can throw statistics at you all day long, but I won't, but there are more African Americans under criminal supervision in the US today than there were slaves at the height of slavery. It's $1 billion industry. We are spending at least, depending on the state, at least 10 times more on incarcerating people than on educating them. And there started to be a mainstream awareness, or a more mainstream awareness around this issue. But ultimately, the thing that I noticed was that in the context of this conversation, I felt there were a few things missing, which led me to writing Incarceration Nations. The first was the presence of a moral conversation. There was a lot of economic conversation around mass incarceration, which led to a kind of bipartisan support for prison reform as it became known. And you had Republicans coming over and supporting prison reform. I mean, the current man in the White House even supports prison reform. So it started to become this joint thing. And yet so much of this was an economic conversation. And my concern was that if we're only having an economic conversation about numbers and recidivism rates and not something that is about the fundamental immorality, the fundamental systemic racism and inequality behind all of this, then we'll find a cheaper way to warehouse Black and brown people in the US and various other groups worldwide. And so how can we have this in a kind of bigger, moral, philosophical way? The other thing that I felt was missing was a focus on the global context for all of this. So these are some of the statistics around just numbers. The US has, of course, is the world's greatest jailer. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prison population. But that, of course, still leaves more than 7 million people, 3.2 of them at least not having been convicted of anything, many of them waiting many years, 6, 7, 8, 9 years for trial. And it seemed that the US was having this conversation in a vacuum, considering our crisis, which, not to put it lightly, is a crisis. 2.3 million people is a lot of people and more than the population of many countries. But it left out the global context for this. And I think what it especially left out is the US's role in exporting this model to the world. And pushing it and promoting it in all kinds of ways. And so some of the things that I write about in Incarceration Nations is this way, the way that the US did this. And this essentially, the US built the first modern prison. The first two models of modern prison, one in New York and one in Pennsylvania. And one is known as the Eastern model, one is known as the Auburn model, and these were based on European ideas that were going around at the time. And then by way of colonialism, all of these forces came to the US to see these modern marvels, and they were a marvel. I often say that the US has been throwing its money away on prisons since the very beginning. There was running water at Eastern State Penitentiary before there was running water at the White House. That's how much was invested in this. Morally and also economically. And so colonial powers came to see this and then took this model to the world. And then through globalization, as the years went on, the model kept being exported. So part of the theme of Incarceration Nations is to show how this has been the cycle, that the US innovates, quote unquote, when it comes to prisons, and then the world, and then has this foisted upon the world one way or another through colonialism and globalization. And so you see things like prison privatization, solitary confinement, all of these systems being imitated in this hideous cut and paste model that exists all around the world. And so for the book, I traveled to 9 countries in an effort to take on kind of the philosophical basis of prisons and think about what are some of the central issues that come to the fore when we think about incarceration. And so I started in Rwanda and South Africa, thinking about restorative justice and really thinking about the concept of punishment and why ultimately punishment to me is a morally unacceptable equation. Essentially, it's hypocrisy. It says, you harmed someone, so we will do harm to you in order to teach you that it's wrong to harm. And thinking about what is another way to conceive of what justice is as restoration, as reparations, in a way that moves away from punishment. And thinking about Rwanda and South Africa as countries where great harms sit at the core of their very being. I went to Uganda and to Jamaica to think about this idea of quote unquote rehabilitation. And when we get there, I'll tell you why I put rehabilitation in quotes, but thinking about the role of the arts in how we bring about better human beings or promote the emergence of better human beings, looking at a music program in Jamaica and a creative writing program in Uganda. I went to Thailand to look at the crisis around women, which we're certainly going to be talking about tonight, women as the fastest rising prison population globally speaking, generally due in almost anywhere, but especially in Thailand and in Southeast Asia, more generally to the war on drugs and to the gendered dynamic of the war on drugs that targets women in a very particular and powerful way. I went to Brazil to look at solitary confinement and supermax prisons. Supermaxes are another American invention that has been foisted upon the world and now exists in one form or another in at least a dozen countries and rising. And thinking about the way that Brazil was enacting that to great expense. Supermaxes are very expensive, and also to tremendous harm and detriment to society, in that nothing about solitary confinement builds better human beings or better, safer communities in any respect. I came here, the first time I came to Australia was to spend time in WA, in Perth, thinking about actually prison privatization. And Australia holds the largest percentage of people in private prisons. In fact, your immigration detention system, which is fully privatized, has been a great inspiration to the current man occupying the White House. That is, and thinking again about privatization as an American invention that once again has been followed as a model and continues to be. We're privatizing everything when it comes to not just prisons, but when we think about electronic tagging devices, when we think about so many privatizing bail and other kinds of processes in the legal system. And of course, likewise, throughout, I was thinking about this, not only the way that the system has been replicated, but the way that the system of racial oppression and neocolonialism has been replicated. So whether we're talking about the Hill people of Thailand, whether we're obviously in the US, African Americans and Latinos are massively over-incarcerated in the US, thinking about, as our panel will be talking about, the indigenous communities here, and in almost every country has its other and has over-incarcerated that othered group in almost identical ways. That is by criminalizing them, usually through the use of petty offenses, and multiplying of petty offenses. In the US, they were called the Black Codes, the Aboriginal Act here, and various acts criminalize, mass incarcerate, usually in order to produce a labor force. And to see that again and again played out in one way or another is a rather painful thing to witness. So from Australia, I went to Singapore, and then to Norway, which is actually sort of what brings me to where I am today, which is thinking about potential solutions. And in Singapore, I'll get back to them in a moment. In Singapore, I was thinking about reentry and reintegration, what it means to come home from prison and face that obstacle course that lies before you, and how that can be dealt with, if at all. And thinking about Singapore's approach to that, which is remarkably innovative in certain respects. And then thinking about Norway as this kind of potential justice utopia, or as it gets talked about quite a bit, utopia period. And what is Norway doing that lands it in this place of being thought of as a model for the world in so many respects, but particularly when it comes to justice and when it comes to prisons or lack thereof. And so the end of the book ultimately took me to the place that I landed in, which is this idea of what is the roadmap out of this, or roadmaps plural, because there is no singular roadmap. But how do we start thinking about and mapping and imagining solutions? And I think of this quote, thank you New Zealand last week actually for introducing me to it, but it moved me because this idea of you've come too far not to go further, you've done too much not to do more, brought me back to the US in its place currently, where the conversation is on everyone's lips, and we're talking mass incarceration. It's a popular topic. It's trendy. I don't get looked at as if I'm insane anymore quite as much. And all of that is powerful. But at the same time, what feels almost missing from the conversation is the visionary, is the imagination, is the radical ideas about what does the solution look like, both in the practical here and now, and also in the long-term big picture. And I also often think about Angela Davis in perhaps my favorite book about justice, Abolition, Democracy, where she cites W.E.B. Du Bois as saying that the one respect, and she says this with all due respect to the abolitionist movement in the US, it was so busy abolishing and destroying, it didn't know quite what it was building and moving toward. And it's because of that Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow and other forms of oppression were able to creep in and reestablish themselves in that context. And so being mindful of that, I thought a lot about ways to be visionary, to be radically imaginative, and think globally about what potential solutions are and how do we use the global context to push the boundaries of what is possible when it comes to justice. And so through the book, I landed in a lot of places globally, one of them being back here and many going back to some of the countries I visited in the context of the book. And it led to the launching of the Incarceration Nations Network, which is also what brings me back here today. And so the motto of INN is correcting and connecting. We do talk about departments of corrections around the world. For the most part, I've never heard of a department of punishment, and yet much of what we do is punish and not correct. So what does real correcting look like? Who needs the real correcting? Is it the people in the prisons, or is it the society that produced them? That's a rhetorical question. And then this idea of connecting. How do we connect people who are doing this work in order to build local coalition and global coalition? So these are the tasks of INN and what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do, and it's in its early stages. And I'll just highlight a couple of words in here that I think are especially important. Under the fourth heading, globally changing the narrative about prisons and the people in them by producing accessible content and events, supporting strides by government in this arena by amplifying progressive programs and policy. I think the two most powerful words there are accessible. I think sometimes when we talk about prisons or we talk about justice, it's not accessible to the average smart person. How do we raise awareness about this so that we mobilize communities to be pushing for policy changes? And so what does accessible content look like? What do accessible events look like? How do we speak in a way so that we're not just preaching to the choir? And I think the other powerful word there is amplifying. In so many contexts that I've been in, there are people doing powerful work, radical work that's rethinking how we build safe communities, and yet their message does not have that broad platform, is not, again, accessible for whatever reason, is going against the grain, and so isn't out there in the public. How do we amplify that? And then I think the other critical word, of course, which I shamelessly put in bold, is promoting the use of radical imagination. Imagination is everything when it comes to justice. It's about really pushing, instead of being strangled by what is, we should be inspired by what could be, liberated by what should be. And not only, if I hear one more time, but that's not realistic, or, but that's not likely to happen, or you're not gonna ever convince them of that, or, I mean, the idea is to push the envelope, because if we set the bar up here, we at least move towards up here. And that isn't to say, as I'll get into in a moment, that there isn't a place for what I think of as, chipping away at the block, or to some extent, what I feel the work I do in the prison to college pipeline is, which is sometimes tinkering in order to make change. So I'm gonna focus on one particular project today and get into as much detail as time allows, which won't be that much. But the current projects that INN is working on, the first was mentioned already, the Prison to College Pipeline, which I see as a movement, not a model, and I'm very emphatic about that, because the model idea is what got us in trouble in the first place. Every time I walk into a 19th century prison that is modeled after Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania, there are over 300 prisons around the world modeled after it. And I've been in a bunch of them, whether it's Santiago, Chile, Kigali, Rwanda. And there is nothing that will hit home harder about just how bereft a cut and paste model of justice is than when you walk into an old rundown prison that was built in the 19th century that has no relevance to a country, to a cultural context, to a present day than when you walk into those. When I walked into Fremantle Prison, actually, which is modeled, it's a museum now, but it's, of course, modeled after Eastern. And so the prison to college pipeline is really a philosophy or a movement. It's the idea that universities have a powerful role to play in creating safer communities, and the idea that anything that is done on the inside must continue on the outside in terms of providing access and services to incarcerated individuals. And so hence the pipeline idea. And so whenever I collaborate in different countries around the prison to college pipeline, I don't walk in there saying this is what the model looks like and here's how you enact it, but rather what do you want to build? What does it look like in South Africa? What does it look like in the UK? What are the particular issues in this context? And basically, how can it be of service in working with that? The writing on the wall is that photo there, which is an art installation. It's by myself and Hank Willis Thomas, who's a African-American visual artist. And we wallpaper spaces with writing by people in prison that I've collected from around the world, some of which is from actually Perth, from the writing workshop that I taught when I was when I was spending time in Perth several years ago. We'll be debuting on the Highline Park in New York in a new iteration in early November, so you're all invited to come see it. And of course, the idea there is using art and using public spaces to intervene, to put voices in places where people may have never thought to quite hear them. INN TV, if you go on incarcerationnationsnetwork.com, is the first of those, has already been produced, and it's a series of short documentaries that connects the struggle from one country to another around particular themes. So the first one is about remand populations, pretrial detention around the world, and focuses on individuals who waited years for trial, who were living, it's called Nightmare, and it's individuals who are living the same nightmare, one in South Africa, one in Trinidad, and one in New York City on Rikers Island. And so thinking about how do we recognize that this crisis looks so similar across the world, really, and how do we address that? And the last one, which I'll jump into now, is this multimedia database and platform on innovative prison reimagining efforts worldwide. It's a bit of a clunky title, but I don't say prison reform efforts. I do sometimes for ease, but again, I'm always pushing imagination. Reform implies that you can, sort of fix it. You can, put the nails here and fix it. And while I do think there's a role for fixing in the here and now, to ultimately have radical change, we need to radically rethink what we're doing around justice altogether. And so the database is meant to do a lot of things. It's a bit of a blueprint of solutions. It's demonstrating what I think to some people is still radical, that you can talk about this issue of reform and reimagining across borders, whether it's state borders. And I think there's quite a lot of similarities in some of the disconnectedness here in terms of state to state. And in the US, we can be incredibly disconnected, New York to California, in terms of knowing the work that's happening everywhere. Bolstering and again, amplifying organizations that are doing this work and getting us all kind of literally on the same page. It will be a website that will be up in October and launching at events in New York, Johannesburg, and London in early November. Replicability, also a term, I don't mean literally replicable. We always have to be mindful of context and culture, but the idea being there are inspirational things happening around the world, even in places where you least expect them. And how are these relevant in other contexts? How can governments, organizations look around and say, that's a strong model, that's an interesting concept, how do I bring that? And then, of course, this idea, I bolded imagination again, I'm a broken record, but combining data with imagination. And I think a big part of that is that too often we're in one box or another. And I check a lot of boxes in life and have tried to bring that to the table of this work. How do we do this so that, yes, we can talk about data, but when we talk about a successful program, it doesn't only mean recidivism rates, right? It also means thinking qualitatively about human lives, because we are talking about human lives and how have we impacted them, and how do we continue to impact them, and how do we attract new funders? Because one of the great crises, which I'll get to in a moment, is the lack of funding around this issue and the lack of support for this issue. So funders are certainly on the list of potential audience, and you'll notice that this audience list is very broad, intentionally. And so the website will have accessible content, but for those of us in an academic space, we can delve more deeply into evaluations and look at that material. But for those who don't want to get that deep, but just want to understand broad-reaching stuff around this issue, they can get into it. I think the last category is especially important, and a huge part of this project is around the voices of those directly impacted and leadership of those directly impacted by this issue. And that means incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals, but also families of those impacted. In many communities, I spend a lot of time in South Africa, and in multiple communities in South Africa, there is almost, if you are as what's known as colored, almost no one does not have a family member who is incarcerated. And so thinking about the impact of that and those voices. And so the idea, in selecting the program, there are two, the database is very broad reaching. There are over 800 programs globally. Not everyone, I'm sure I missed some. It's impossible to, in fact, every country I go to, I'll learn about 5 more that I didn't know about, but the idea is this will be a living, breathing thing that can grow and evolve and be added to. But there are also, then we selected through consultation with what I called global justice consultants around the world, which of these do we want to hone in on? How do we create this combination of broad-reaching national programs, but also smaller scale programs? And lastly, I think this is so important, the prison to college pipeline, which I'm enormously proud of and obviously think is very, very powerful, I still think of it as cleaning up the mess, because the students in my program are often talked about as getting a second chance at education through this program. No, they're actually getting a first chance, because they come from systemically disadvantaged communities where they never really had a first chance. And so I wish my program did not exist in the first place. All of my students should have had access to higher education and to decent, all levels of education, such that they would not have ended up in prison in the first place and in the prison to college pipeline. But I do think there's certainly a place for cleaning up the mess, even as we're simultaneously thinking about big picture systems-oriented programs. And so we divided up into broad categories: direct services for those directly impacted, incarcerated, and formerly incarcerated. And those are some words we gave out questionnaires to the various organizations who are part of the process. And we also asked some of these organizations to give their clients questionnaires. And one of those was to use adjectives to describe the work of the organization. And these are some of the terms that came up again and again for those directly impacted: confidence, empowerment, family, respect, support, and so on, family again. And the other 2 categories: alternatives to incarceration and broadly speaking, policy and advocacy work. So I obviously have to focus as well on the overrepresented groups in the criminal justice system. And as I was mentioning earlier, there are versions of those all over the world. So overrepresented groups, of course, we know what that is in this context, in the US context. But there are also, even thinking, many people imagine that there's, in Europe, Norway is all the same. Actually, the Roma population is massively overrepresented in almost every country in Europe's prison population. Foreigners, Eastern Europeans in the Scandinavian system. So there are these broadly speaking overrepresented groups. Thinking about programs, of course, targeting specifically women, as we'll be talking about, and specifically remand populations, again, because of this issue of waiting years and years for trial. I won't try to break down. There are a lot of organizations, and I won't be able to get into them. So what I'm going to do is just run quickly through the different categories. You can get a sense of some of the countries. I didn't put comprehensive lists there of all the countries or programs, but some of them that, and if you're interested in any in particular, we can talk about it during the Q&A, or you can come up to me afterward and grab me, or you can just email me, hey, what's that program in Chile? But it'll all be up on the website. But policy and advocacy, it's just worth noting. Now, of course, policy and advocacy is very broad, and how organizations are doing this is also context and culture specific. But that said, there are a number of overreaching issues that people are advocating around in various countries. And so petty offenses are generally remnants of colonial legal systems. As I was mentioning, the Black Codes, the Aboriginal Acts here. In Malawi, for example, there was quite a lot of work that's been done on the petty offenses there around loitering, which is still on the books in almost every post-colonial context. And often that relates to the war on drugs. Obviously, both of these are ways that they're used as systems of racial and social control. Whether it's marijuana being used to target certain communities and to earn police a living in various countries where the police salary is basically bribes. And so thinking about those conditions and sentencing are, of course, two other broad areas that generally people are advocating around how basic conditions, solitary confinement, and the abolition of it. And the approaches generally tend to involve these research, strategic litigation, and media. I highlight on here Prison Insider, which is a wonderful and actually the only kind of global prison media website that's doing some really powerful work to call attention to. Now, of course, they're not directly they're not an advocacy organization, they're media. As is the Marshall Project in the US, which focuses on criminal justice reform, but bringing attention and awareness in much the way that many of the reports intend to do. So jumping to, and I'm going to, again, run through these very quickly, so apologies, but I could really talk all night about these because of the complexity of what's happening. So alternative to incarceration sort of falls under, we have them falling under three headings that are not hard and fast, because there's restorative justice, diversion, and mediation. But of course, many organizations that are doing diversion work, for instance, the family group conferences and the Rangatahi courts, which I was just in New Zealand, are deeply shaped by restorative justice approaches. And so they're not hard and fast categories. There's a lot of fluidity there. But alternatives to incarceration programs are, generally speaking, ways, of course, of keeping people out of. Now, alternative to incarceration is also a term that I hate, because alternative to incarceration implies that the main way to do things is incarceration, and then we can find some alternatives, when in fact, that should be the main dish. And incarceration should be, the absolute last resort, if at all, and it should look so different from prisons as to be worthy of another name altogether. So, but I would say overall that one of the exciting, and I've seen a lot of different approaches to diversion, and drug courts are, of course, one form of that. But I think I'm most excited by Costa Rica's National Restorative Justice Program, which, although it's tiny, is actually instituted into the system and has been legally implemented. I'm also particularly excited by this Bangladeshi model of mediation, because what it does is prevent people from getting to the legal system in the first place, which, as we know in many countries, is glutted, is overrun. And so hence another direct service issue, or a direct services provider, is legal and bail assistance. And this is worthy of its own lecture, because this is a crisis worldwide. Ultimately, I'm not sure there's any greater imposition of sort of colonialism and colonial whiteness in particular than legal systems. and particularly in a post-colonial context. And the metaphor for me, or the image that comes to mind when I think about legal systems in a post-colonial context, is an image of being in Ghana and sitting in court and seeing the judges wear those wigs. And they're sweating, and the sweat is pouring down their face, and because it's hot in Ghana, and whoever thought of putting a wool wig on a Ghanaian judge. And to me, that's a metaphor for a system that doesn't fit. And these are various programs that are trying to take that on in many respects through whether it's legal empowerment, through the building of lawyers and paralegals, educating incarcerated individuals to be lawyers and paralegals in various respects. That's the African Prisons Project. All of these are approaches that are taken. Reentry, another term that I think we often throw these terms around in criminal justice speak. Reentry implies that, oh yeah, you left and now reenter. In fact, you were never entered in the first place, right? The bulk of people in prisons around the world have been disenfranchised for a long time. And so it's not a reentry, it's an entry in the first place. And so thinking about Singapore, this is the image of one thing that Singapore does that is actually not rocket science, but yet radical, is get people jobs before they come home from prison. And 95% of them, and then follow up and have job coaches go around, not parole officers who are necessarily spying on them or being policemen, but job coaches who are supporting them as they reintegrate. Education is something that is very natural to me to support. This is a picture from a program in Italy called Articolo 3, which allows people at Bollate prison in Milan to leave prison, go to university on the outside, and then go back at night. And it provides all kinds of access and support for them to do that. So this individual in the picture is incarcerated. Related to that, and again, some of these categories are fluid because education prepares you for a job, but direct job services. So whether it's the last mile in the US, which is providing coding training for people, or Haluma Lisa in South Africa providing jobs in gardening, horticulture, and food development, all necessary industries. I think what's most important is the idea that they are cooperative models. Not all of these are. As an anti-capitalist, I don't support. I understand job training and I understand that people have to make a living, but I can support getting people jobs, but I can get excited about getting people co-ownership and shared ownership. And so the Brazilian programs up there are actually building co-ops inside prisons. I mentioned families of the incarcerated. Noteworthy on this list is Chile's program, which is a government program. I get excited whenever a program is a government program because it means that they're trying to institutionalize it, support it, and fund it. And there is generally such a lack of funding. Another term that I use very grudgingly, rehabilitative services. Rehabilitation implies that you've been habilitated in the first place. And as we know, that's not the case with those disenfranchised individuals, othered individuals around the world. So all of these organizations are using various approaches. Health services, there are obviously, this is a quote from a woman in Natasha, if I can't eat, I can't think. If I'm struggling with TB and HIV, how are you going to talk to me about rehabilitation? And so thinking about basic health standards around the world and how we address them. Staff training is incredibly powerful. You can change many of the landscapes of a system. You can make a beautiful building and build a new prison that looks gorgeous. You can throw classrooms in every prison, but if your staff is still stuck in the old way of doing things and isn't thinking differently and isn't coming from a different background, not a military background, but a psychology background, a social work background, a background of true integration and holistic approaches, then you're not going to get anywhere. And so how do we think radically about different approaches? And those are the two organizations there. And then the last category in direct services is innovative alternatives to traditional prisons. And I think these are, in many respects, the most exciting, and I'll share a quick story and then I'll wrap up. And that story is of these two prisons that are pictured here. So this right here is Vanaja Prison in Finland. It's the living quarters for the women who are incarcerated there. Finland is a country that has seesawed back and forth in terms of control and ideology between Russia and Sweden, two very different approaches. And in the early 2000s, it decided we're going the Swedish route. And that meant broadly in terms of social services, but specifically in terms of the justice system as well. And it didn't poll its people and say, do you want to go this route? It said, this route makes more sense and is more humane. And so it radically decarcerated its population, so much so that when I stayed there, I stayed in a prison that is now a nice hotel. Because there was no need for the prison, and it created an open prison model, and it broke down those walls, created radically safer communities in the process, and so on and so forth. And it did so to great success and to great fanfare. And in the Czech Republic, they looked over there and said, hey, there seems to be this model that's working, and it's opened the doors. And people, in fact, it's so radical that if you go to look at this prison and visit it, there's nothing to see because everybody's out working jobs or going to school and just coming home in the evening. And so Czech Republic, from there, built its first open prison and that it hopes will be a model to the rest of the country, and is trying to crack open the walls and break down the barriers. And I think that's something to get excited about because it's really getting in there and literally smashing the walls. So I leave you with my favorite words, radical imagination, but also radical hope and radical possibilities. And I think about the word radical, which comes from the word root. And that's where the logo of Incarceration Nations Network comes from, this idea of building roots, because radical is not something that's pie in the sky out there. It's something that is rooted in what is possible, what we can hope for, and the possibilities that we can build. And I was going to get into a whole set of more commonalities, but we can do that during the Q&A. I will shut up now. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Baz. It has been a long road for us to meet, but just going on your imagination, I just recently finished working in the Royal Commission in the Northern Territory and seen some real good imagination up there with the Territory government, where they basically just painted over the adult prison name and typed in Don Dale Juvenile Centre. So that's the type of imagination that we're getting in this country at the moment. So just on that, I just wanted to, before I introduce the panel, I just wanted to say that, give you a picture of basically where we're at in this country. Indigenous Australians make up 2.8% of the population. We make up 28% of the prison population. Our men make up 11% more times easy to get in prison than males, non-Indigenous males, and Indigenous women are 15 times. And then if we go to our youth, they're about 25 times that than our non-Indigenous people. So, and then if we look at our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have disability, we're looking at 45% of those, and they're that is either disability or long-term conditions. So this sort of paints the picture, but also this does not include mental health for our people. So, I mean, that just paints what sort of situation Indigenous people are facing currently in this country in regards to the prisons and over incarceration. So now I'll just introduce you to our panel. Deb Kilroy is a long-term friend of mine. She's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Sisters Inside, and there's a whole lot more of that, but she's including an abolitionist and has a very strong voice on that. So we'll hear some concerns today about some of the issues in Australia around prisons. Dr. Talia Anthony is based at UTS, University of Technology in Sydney, and is leading a research in systemic racism and colonial legacies in the criminal justice system. Damien Griffiths is a descendant of the Warmi people of the Manning Valley in New South Wales. He's leading advocate for the human rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability. Damien has been a central figure in the establishment of both the Aboriginal Disability Network New South Wales and also the National People's Disability Network. And Roxanne Moore is a Noongar woman from Perth, a human rights lawyer from Margaret River in Western Australia. She is currently working as a principal advisor to Change the Record Coalition and also for the National Peak Body on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services. So can we give them a round of applause, please?
No worries. Well, thank you for your presentation. It was great, and I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce the issue of the intersection between racism and ableism, or racism and disability. We would say at the First Peoples Disability Network, so as Eddie said, we're a national organisation representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability and their families. Very unique because we are governed by Aboriginal people that have disability themselves. But we would say disability is a major factor which is often overlooked in incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as Eddie said, at least 45% of our people have some form of disability or long-term health condition. But that's actually considered a conservative figure because we don't have a measure, as Eddie said, on the prevalence of psychosocial disability or mental illness. In fact, at First Peoples Disability Network, we would say it'd be pretty exceptional for an Aboriginal person not to have experienced post-traumatic stress or anxiety or depression, for example. So we remain very concerned about the lack of focus on this issue. And there's a growing body of research starting to happen, which is a very good thing. And there was a recent report created at the University of New South Wales by Professor Eileen Baldry and others, which was called A Predictable and Preventable Path, Aboriginal People with Mental and Cognitive Disabilities in the Criminal Justice System. And that report not only highlighted the very high prevalence of cognitive impairment. So when I say cognitive impairment, I'm talking about brain injury, intellectual disability, new emerging disabilities like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, for example. One of the quotes, and there's many within that report, but one of them that really stands out to me, and the quote says, disability emerged as part of the accepted overall presentation of Aboriginal people with multiple and complex support needs in the criminal justice system. So effectively, disability is almost normalised amongst the Aboriginal prison population. And when we start thinking about in terms of young Aboriginal people with cognitive impairments, they rarely have an early diagnosis. And they often live in extreme poverty, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about the intersectional issue of poverty too. And for Aboriginal women with cognitive impairment, they very likely have to experience sexual violence throughout their life. The New South Wales Council for Intellectual Disability talks about prisons as a way to warehouse people with disability. There's some startling statistics that talk about 87% of youth, be they Aboriginal or not, in custody have a psychological disorder of some kind. And I was reminded recently, I was doing an interview with the ABC in the Kimberley, and there was a colleague from the Aboriginal Legal Service in Western Australia in the interview, and he estimated that 90% of his clients, Aboriginal clients, have a cognitive impairment of some kind. So whether he's being precise is not the point. It's a hell of a lot of people. Then we have some extraordinary situations in Australia which play out in the NT in particular, with the indefinite detention of Aboriginal people with disability in prisons in the Northern Territory, in the 2 prisons. So the last time I was made aware, there was still 32 Aboriginal people with disability who were indefinitely detained. So they were detained in prison, effectively accommodated in prison, because there's no meaningful disability support system in the Northern Territory. And sometimes some of these people were in there for a very long time, and they were living amongst the mainstream, the main prison population, obviously very vulnerable. I think the other area that, you know, as a disability advocate, we're always concerned about, and we would argue is another form of incarceration, is what used to be referred to as the old mental health institutions. And many of them have closed down in Australia, but the ongoing community support is often lacking. And we would say they are some of the most secretive places in the country. In fact, they're even more secretive, we would argue, than many prisons. I can think of the institutions in New South Wales in places like Peat Island and Stockton Hospital and Bloomfield in Orange, usually always located next to a river or high up on a hill, because the view was back in the colonising days that to keep the bad spirits away, but very secretive places. And hopefully the Royal Commission into Abuse and Neglect of People with Disability will bear that out. But they are situations where people with disability, we would argue, are incarcerated simply because they have a disability. Often, people with disability were in these institutions from birth. So I'm probably taking too much time now, but I guess we're just anxious to see a greater understanding and focus on the intersectional aspects of disability and racism, this othering, and disability scholars would talk about theories of deviancy and these kind of things that have pervaded society, and not just in Australia but around the world, where people with disability, and particularly Aboriginal people, have been incarcerated. And my only other final point is one of the things we hope to discover through the Royal Commission on Abuse and Neglect of People with Disability is exactly how many Aboriginal people with disability were institutionalised. It's still a mystery in many ways, and a lot of those Aboriginal people with disability were simply not aware of their Aboriginality even. So, but I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And also that, you know, all of the work that we're doing today, really we're walking on the shoulders of giants, our warriors, our ancestors who've come before us and have been fighting this so-called justice system since it was set up. So just acknowledging that. I think that, you know, something that you touched on, Baz, is around how, you know, if we are to end these injustices, we have to really dismantle and not reform, you know, capitalism, racism, and all these colonial structures that we have. And, you know, that can seem so overwhelming and where to start, but it's such important work that we have to do rather than tinkering around the edges, you know, with reformist work, like you mentioned, and recognising that in Australia, the system isn't broken. This is exactly what it was set up to do. You know, 250 years ago, we didn't have prisons in Australia, and the very first prisons here, like Rottnest Island in Western Australia, where I'm from, you know, a lot of that was set up for Aboriginal people, and the crimes, the so-called crimes, were related to slavery, and you know, a lot of my ancestors were locked up and killed there, and that's continuing today. And you know, on your point of rehabilitation, and you know, in the more reformist space, when we're talking about solutions in justice, there's a lot of talk about, you know, healing and you know, programs that can like fix us. But, you know, I just think about like Tanya Day and Miss Dew, and like there was no amount of like prevention programs or like diversion or healing or rehabilitation that could have saved their lives. You know, Tanya Day was a 55-year-old Aboriginal woman who was on a train to Melbourne and fell asleep and never made it home. And tomorrow her family is fighting for the coronial inquiry to consider systemic racism as part of that. Oh, we've got a sign up the back here. Thank you for that. consider systemic racism as part of the coronial inquiry. Like, how is this not clear that it's systemic racism that over 400 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have died in custody since 30 years ago we had a Royal Commission into it that set out all the solutions to prevent it from happening? Like, it's clearly systemic racism and systemic issues. And then, in terms of the global context, Australia, I think, thinks of itself as this, noble, civilised place, but we're literally torturing Aboriginal kids in prison. Like in the Northern Territory in Dondale, you may have seen like the Four Corners report, Dylan Voller, what he went through, hooded and restrained. But it's not only the Northern Territory. Like there's 100% of kids in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal in prison, but that's the same as Cleveland in Northern Queensland. And similarly there, kids are being hogtied and sedated. They were being, had dogs set onto them. And so I think we have to really have a hard look at ourselves in terms of where we're at in comparison to the rest of the world. Like, Australia is doing this sort of thing to Aboriginal kids as young as 10 years old in every state and territory. And globally, the median age of criminal responsibility is 14 years. And it's higher in places like China, it's like higher up to like 16 years. And yet in Australia, we're locking up kids even sometimes as young as like 8 years old. So I think that in terms of solutions, it really comes back to self-determination. And what that means is, treaty. It means us being able to make decisions about our lives. It means, getting control back to our communities and our community-controlled organisations. It means that we're running the services and supports that we know we can deliver to our people in a way that's actually helpful and meaningful, because it's going to challenge the systemic racism. And yet we're seeing constantly this push from this federal government away from supporting our community-controlled services. And recently with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, they decided to mainstream the funding for Aboriginal legal services into with legal aid and community legal centres. And this is all steps away from self-determination. There's solutions like justice reinvestment in Bourke, where the Bourke Tribal Council has led this work for over 5 years, and they're now seeing, because they're implementing like place-based solutions that they know are really going to work for their community, like a 23% reduction in family violence and recidivism for family violence, as well as like a 38% reduction in the number of offences that young people are committing. So I think that, it is a really important point that like self-determination and what's going to work is going to look different in every particular place. And for us, having Indigenous-led solutions, it might be disability, it might be bush mob, it might be the Koori courts and Murray courts, it might be the youth engagement program in Western Australia. We need these, but we also need to address those systemic issues so that like we end the criminalisation of poverty, like those petty offences like you were talking about. Because with colonisation, they set up the entrenched in poverty and then they criminalise us for not being able to pull ourselves out of the entrenched poverty. And it's an ongoing cycle. I think that's probably all I'm going to say, but just that Change the Record has a campaign at the moment focusing on ending the criminalisation of poverty called Free Our Future, and we've got a petition on our website that it would be fantastic for people to jump on, sign and share, which calls for things like abolishing those petty offences that particularly target, women and people with disability and other people affected by First Nations people who are struggling to make ends meet. So, thanks.
What to say after that? Hi everyone, I'm Debbie Kilroy from Sisters Inside. Before I speak tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. I reside on unceded Nullumpu land, which is south of, in Meanjin, south Brisbane, whitefellas call. That runs down to Quandamuka, Minjerribah. I suppose listening to you speak, Baz, and sort of coming here tonight and wondering what to say, there's lots of things to say. And I suppose what I want to say first is that we have to start thinking outside the bars. And we've got to stop using the prison industrial complex's language, because we still move in and out of that. And you're right, the US is great. It markets its prisons industry really well, and we grab that and run with it, as well as justice reinvestment, which I actually oppose, because I see that as a net widening exercise again. Because no program is going to fix anybody up. That's the reality. Whether it's a pipeline to college, from prison to college, because we see all these pipelines, but they actually net widen. We've actually got to unpack society, tear down the prison walls, address the racial capitalism in this world, and actually start supporting social supports and services in our community so that everyone does have access to health, housing, education, and employment if they choose to do so. We can't actually have a program in a prison to say, I'm going to get a job when I'm released. I actually want to get educated, and I want to challenge the education system for failing me in the first instance, where I don't have to go to prison and have a program to go to college or to university or school or to read and write for that matter. When we know if you go into the Townsville Women's Prison, probably about 90% of the women are there are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and over 80% can't read and write. And all of a sudden it becomes an individualistic problem because of capitalism and how we're so individualised, in not only in this country but around the world because of racial capitalism. Us as individuals are to blame for our own failures. We don't actually look at the systems that continue to fail. So all our little programs that we lobby for, and justice reinvestment is one of them, actually doesn't address the drastic issues in our community, which I said before is the health, the housing and the education and those systems. And we continue to pour buckets of money, billions of dollars down a prison industry that's a fundamental failure. Yes, it's set up, it works how it is, but it's a failure in the sense because it chews and spits out people worse than ever before. And that we're told when we go to prison, as I was told when I was sentenced the last time, and times before, like I've been involved in the prison industry since I was 13. So we're talking about, 46 years, 40, I don't know how old am I, 45, maybe 45 years. And, the reality is it's a system that fails. And so we actually got to keep our eye on the target and stop thinking about the bars every time we think of crime, that someone has to be locked up. Because today, what isn't a crime may be a crime tomorrow, or vice versa. So crime's an actual theory, and it's about roping in and drawing in certain behaviours that the white middle upper class don't like, that the colonisers hate. So whether it be public drunkenness, whether it be begging, whether it's about homeless people on the street, we see new laws coming through Parliament, whatever jurisdiction is, and federal for that matter, to actually criminalise people and pipeline them into the prison industry. And that's what we've got to stop. And if we're part of that prison industry or welfare industry, which is the other issue, because let's face it, when we look at homelessness, when we look at the prison industry, when we look at housing, when we look at health, lots of people are actually employed in those industries and making money on the backs of the most marginalised people in this country. The time has come where we've actually got to distribute the wealth. We have enough wealth in this country to ensure that no person is homeless, but we actually accept that. And we actually sit in one of the most prestigious universities in the country that has a shitload of money, and very, very privileged people come through this university and come out the other side. And I suppose, I put a challenge out to those of you that are doing law or that are lawyers. How are you using that privilege? Like, how are you using that privilege? Are you using it in a way? Because it's actually, you have something that not many people will have in their lives, which is a law degree, and have the power to walk into a courtroom and be heard. Other people can go in a courtroom and ask to be heard. Academics can ask to be heard. But lawyers, those of us who are lawyers, we can actually go into a courtroom and we will be heard because we are lawyers. So what are we doing with that privilege? Because it is a privilege. So I want you to think about that. If you've come to do law to make a shitload of money, that's fine. Go down the top end of town and we'll be coming after you at the end of the day. But I mean, but no, I'm serious. Because what is it about? Money, really? At the end of the day, when you're lying on your deathbed, what are you going to say? God, I wish I made some more money and had another car or another house. No, you're actually going to wish you got family and friends around you. But guess what? But because you become so individualised in the racial capitalist system that you will have no connection to any community. So we need to unpack our whiteness, unpack our privilege, and unpack the prison industrial complex.
You must be feeling like you're among kindred spirits sitting on a panel with all these socialists.
Always.
Look, I'm not going to add much more. I'm really keen to hear questions. I just want to say, Eddie mentioned the Royal Commission in the Northern Territory into the protection and detention of children. What really was apparent from that Royal Commission, from the evidence that Aboriginal people put, was that what they wanted was country, community and family. They didn't want programs. They didn't want elders in prisons. They wanted to be on country, to be with their elders. And so I think that when we talk about decriminalisation, decarceration, we also need to talk about decolonisation and deinstitutionalisation, whether that's the institutions of the state or of the ruling class. I think that we are not new to mass incarceration in Australia. Indigenous people here have known that system since the very early colonial period, and it was a system set up to confine them so their land could be taken, to assimilate and acculturate them, and to effectively teach them white ways and white industrial ways. So prisons could take the form of mission stations, ration camps, of cattle stations. It could also be orphanages for kids, and today we still send too many Aboriginal children to group homes and residential institutions. So it was part of a trajectory, a colonial project. And although I know you said that the US takes the title in incarceration, when I examined the statistics a year or so ago, in fact, Australia and Indigenous people are incarcerated at higher rates, at 2,500 per 100,000, which exceeds even African Americans. So we really have a lot of work to do in terms of reversing, like stemming the tide, not even talking about, reducing it. It would be good next year if we don't have more people in prison, but Debbie can talk to you about the new prisons they're building for that very purpose, to build this prison population that's spiralling out of control. And you spoke about women increasing around the world. For non-Aboriginal women, for non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, it's pretty flat. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, it's spiking. And I think the racialised dynamic of incarceration and criminalisation, whether that is in a prison or a police cell, where sadly Tanya Day passed, and we'll be hearing about that tomorrow, all these forms of incarceration need to be challenged. Solitary confinement, I don't know if it came from the US. They did it really well in Palm Island when they took Aboriginal people there and punished them. I think what's really clear about the message of this panel is that prison is a pattern across the world because forms of oppression are a pattern across the world, and that's what we really need to be challenging. We have many, voices that have provided alternatives in this country. We just really need to start listening to those voices.
We talk about imagining abolition, a world without prisons. And it seems to be safer for mainstream Australia to use that language when I usually talk about abolition, people start freaking out and get their barriers up and go, what about the rapists and the murderers? But I mean, so what we've done is the movement is imagining abolition, a world without prison. So then we can talk about how to get there instead of like just talking about reformist agendas, because we need to use decarceration strategies. But it's interesting about language, because what I see now in this country, because some people are using that language, imagining abolition and decarceration, but they're actually talking about reform. So, my issue with justice reinvestment is a few things. One, we assume there's justice in the first instance, and what are we reinvesting? If we look at the few models that are occurring, yes, they might be getting some runs on the board and might be getting some good stats, but 9 hours down the road, for example, from the Burke Justice Reinvestment Program, is a 1,700-cell prison that's been sold out to Serco. Now, no one in that justice reinvestment that I'm aware of is actually talking against prisons. They focus on this little program because it's got so much money, academics involved in it, and they get the evaluation money. So it becomes another project, another program about that is coming from a position of power over of the people that they are experimenting on in the justice reinvestment framework. So I would like to see us, if your little program, I'd rather your program be talking about and coming with us on the movement to actually end the building of prisons. Because if a program, for example, is going to work, we can't be building a 1,700-cell prison here and have a program here because 30 people it's done wonderful things for. And that's great, but what about the 1,700 people at any one day that's going to keep rolling and rolling and rolling, and that disaster in itself? So we need to take the blinkers off. And
I think for me, the way that I think of it is it's not an either or, right? It's not, because there are lives in the here and now, and I refuse to be so theoretical that I can't see the suffering and be engaged in the lives of those in the here and now. And that, I think, is the great challenge. I mean, in the US, we had the First Step Act, which was the alleged Prison Reform Act that passed. It divided the movement in the US. It ultimately passed, but has barely been funded, so it was all smoke and mirrors anyway. But it divided the movement because half the movement said, absolutely not, because this sells out the long term in the name of the short term. And the other half of the movement said, but this is going to get tens of thousands of people out of prison in the here and now. And that's a genuine dilemma. But I think we can never sell that dilemma, the impact of that dilemma, short by just saying, oh, it's so easy. No, don't sell them out in the name of the big picture. Because I just refuse to ever stop thinking about the lives in the here and now. And when I look at the prison to college pipeline, which I was talking about specifically as something that I wish didn't exist, that I wish I never had to start. But at the same time, I recognize how many lives it's saved. And that's a reality too. So to me, it's a constant contradiction and this constant dilemma of this big picture, long-term, and here and now, which we always have to look at as well.
Yeah, but look, I'm in the prison on a daily basis, and sisters and sides in every prison in our jurisdiction every day. So yes, we are there, and our management committee is made up of women in prison who are actually in prison. So don't get me wrong when I'm talking about abolition, because we actually do the work. You've got to do the work on the ground to be able to feed into the big picture to understand what's happening in women's lives. And so we actually need to ensure that anything we do, as like we say, is nothing about us without us. So people with the lived experience must be involved in that direction and where we're going to in imagining abolition and how we get there. Yeah. Oh, it's time up. I thought we just got started.
I just want to, if it's okay, Eddie, I just want to quickly respond to the justice reinvestment point. And we've had these conversations before, Deb. I understand your concerns, and I think they're really valid. Like, you don't want solutions which involve, reinforcing the carceral system as like the ultimate solution. And I completely agree with that. But I also think in terms of like self-determination, I'm not sure it's your place to be telling a community which has decided that this is what they want for themselves, and it's actually really been Aboriginal-led right from the beginning, and it's been very grassroots. It's been completely different from any way that it's been done in the States. I'm just not sure that it's your role to be saying that that's not appropriate for them. And I feel like if we're really, if we're really like sticking to, promoting self-determination, then we have to like also, respect that it's going to look different in different places, and that, if that's what Aboriginal people want, obviously there's like unlearning to be done, and like things that we need to do to educate like our communities about like, what is a decarceration strategy and not. But I just also think that it's important that our solutions are Aboriginal-led, community-led and self-determined.
Okay. The panel can discuss this over dinner. But I assume that the crowd out here wants to ask some questions. So can I just say before we do, don't start asking the question till you got the mic, because we've been recorded, and you've missed half of the question being asked. So follow in the front.
I think structural reforms are very important. However, if you look at the trajectory of the punitive systems, which you outlined very well, which started in the United States in the 19th century, even probably earlier, there's been a real continuation of this. I was actually personally involved in some of these struggles in the 70s, and I went to the United States. I was involved with some of the black movements. But what amazes me is that this kind of punitive consciousness, which has been accepted by a large section of the population and which is being pushed by very right-wing media, like Murdoch media and so on, has persisted. And in my view, I think what we have to do is we have to be really determined that the kind of changes we bring about are really revolutionary, that the actual structures are changed. And the social class system has to be abolished.
Thank you for the talk. What part of shutting down prisons, not building prisons, seems to be hard, low as the crime rate is hard to understand? Because there's evidence around the world that, for example, building prisons just adds to the crime rate. So actually shutting down prisons is the best way to lower the crime rate.
Can we all nod our heads in agreement? I think, but unfortunately that implies that our criminal justice systems globally are based on logic and actual data, which unfortunately is not the case.
But our crime rate is actually down. Yeah. Our crime rate is a lot lower than it was, I think, in the 90s. But it's about... More prisons. We're still building more prisons. That's right, because people are coming in there for different reasons. Yeah.
I'd like to ask the panel whether or not you have looked at the problem that we have with incarceration and the impact upon it of the adversarial system. As one of those privileged people you identified before, and having spent now the best part of 30 years in that system, I wonder whether it is appropriate for a modern age, and whether you've looked at, for example, in Norway, it's the fact that they're using a much more inquisitorial state-led system rather than leaving it to the individual protagonists, which we can't fund in any event. And I'd like your opinions on how that impacts on our incarceration rates where people cannot have appropriate representation.
Talia?
Well, I mean, there's the issue that people are not well represented, even where they do have representation, as well as the lack of representation. But another issue in the adversarial system, who's the one from the law school here? The other problem is that prosecutors have become tougher on sentencing and on bail refusals. And so we've got a... Sorry? That's how they built their careers. Yeah, but you go back 20 or 30 years ago, prosecutors used to be a lot more facts-based and facts-driven. Now they're driven by the impetus to incarcerate effectively. That is a win for a prosecutor. And it shouldn't be the role of the state to deprive the liberties of individuals, and yet that is the overriding, it seems, the overriding purpose of the prosecutor. The prosecutor should be there to work in the public interest, and if we're really looking at what we're talking about tonight, it's not in the public interest to be locking people up.
I think we also have issues with separation of powers with, governments putting legislation in that, in regards to presumption of bail is no longer, mandatory sentencing, and it goes on. So I think those compact the whole issue as well.
But we're also funneling everything, and I'm speaking globally, and especially in places where there's a lack of lawyers, and places, including the US, where there's a lack of lawyers unless you can pay for justice. We just funnel everything into the criminal justice system, which is ludicrous, right? And so that's why I didn't get into the detail about the work that's happening that I saw in Bangladesh and Malawi around community mediators. Where is the community in law? I mean, I know I'm speaking in a law school, but I have, frankly, very little respect for law as a system, to be honest, because it is so imposed and so full, inaccessible, ununderstandable to those who are caught in it, deliberately so, and it operates on every level in people's lives, as this mechanism of social control. And so it has to be radically undone.
Is it on? Oh, cool. Thank you all so much for coming. I think I have a question around, I think most of us are pretty aware of the sorts of systemic inequalities that contribute to the prison population being as it is. I think what I and what a lot of other people who are trying to change minds and raise awareness about this is the minute that you start sort of discussing prison abolition or dismantling prison systems, you start getting into, you get someone that says, oh, but what about the victims? What about the families? And you get this, I don't know if you've encountered it, but I just wonder if you think about the sort of victim-perpetrator dynamic that is so often and so frequently used to sort of justify the prison system, and sort of some strategies or ways to sort of counter that, if that made any sense at all. Thanks.
Anyone?
I've got a lot to say on that. So I think a few things. Number one, most of the time people don't recognize that victim and perpetrator is not a binary, and that when we talk about criminal justice systems, we're talking about people who have been victimized, that it is the cycle of hurt people, and so on and so forth, and that these are intimately connected. And so that's, I think, number one. Number two is that we imagine, you alluded to this, what about the rapists and the murderers? And then people imagine that the justice system is filled with these rapists and murderers. And frankly, I always say, I've met many people who have committed murder. I've yet to meet a murderer. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist in the world, but there is a difference between a murderer, someone who is out there murdering people, and someone who has committed the act of murder, and that is to not to minimize the act of murder at all. But we need to recognize that that's not what our criminal justice system is full of. Now, that said, we should also never minimize acts of violence and acts of harm against individuals, and we should never lose our sense of outrage at harm that is caused in communities. But I think the axiomatic assumption is that what those who have been harmed desire and will benefit from and is revenge, when in fact that is again and again what we're seeing as we explore this issue in communities. And there's a California study that came out recently around the needs of survivors. I spent time in Rwanda around survivors in a restorative justice process in South Africa, thinking about what are the needs of those who have been harmed? And often we have a great misconception around what that is. And there's a student of mine in the prison to college pipeline who's been now on his 27th year of incarceration, has been denied by the parole board 5 times. And 2 parole board denials ago, what they said to him is, your victim wants more time from you. And the most painful thing about that statement is, maybe we ought to think that your victim has needs that are not being met by locking somebody up for another year and another year and another year and another year. So it all comes down to radically rethinking what this idea of harm is, and that's where I think the real radicalism is. The assumption is prison's going to do the job, right? But we know it does a very different job, a very intentional job.
And also, victims aren't given much of a voice in our criminal justice system. You know, very rarely does a victim come forward in sentencing, for example. And when we've had cases of Indigenous people coming forward in sentencing and saying, well, actually, I would rather that person go through men's business than go to prison, the courts have said that's not relevant to us. That's not relevant to the Anglo-Australian legal system. And what's further is Moana Jackson, a Maori scholar and activist, talks about prison not really being about harm. The way Maori people did it was to have collective reparation, to have a making of amends. And I think we need to unthink the prison as the norm. Prison's a very recent manifestation that came with industrial capitalism. We need to deconstruct some of our thinking around prisons being the equivalent of a strategy for victims.
I think too, if I could just keep going on that, a couple of things. Those of us that are prison abolitionists actually work really hard to work out how to minimise harm in communities always. We're always talking, having conversations, really heavy, hard conversations about how is it that we can stop violence in our communities to actually imagine abolition and get there, because it is about harm. But let's not forget, the prison is the most harmful. Like, it is the rapist, it is the murderer. You know, we've had over 400 Aboriginal people die in custody, whether it's a watch house or a prison, since the Rikki Tikki, and that system has facilitated those murders, right? And we know, day in, day out, that the prison facilitates rapes inside prison. So we need to not let prison off the hook by saying, what about these people? Because we actually let the system off the hook. But those of us that are abolitionists have really in-depth, difficult conversations about, you know, how do we minimise harm, address harm, end harm and violence in our communities? What is it that we need to do and how do we get there? Because it is a long road, and it's probably a road that, you know, it'll keep going long past my lifetime.
Can I say on that, also as a former criminal lawyer, there's a lot of bastardisation of Aboriginal culture in the criminal justice system. Payback, that's one form of payback. You know, there's a whole mediation and a whole process that mediation and payback on communities that's never been really explored by the court system. It's about a winning for your client and that feeling of having a rush for having a win in court. But the reality is that from a black man from the territory, culture's been bastardised in the court system, and I think we need to really have a look at that and explore that a lot more, because now when we talk about culture, there's a lot of laws that have been made that Aboriginal people can't even be recognised as, what a similar circumstance person would be like, with their culture and where they're from and their background. It's not allowed to take into account in some states in regards to criminal law. So there's a lot of issues that we need to really look at, and unfortunately for Aboriginal people, we're just used as a political football. The lady with the microphone.
Thank you, Eddie. First of all, my name's Joanne Atkinson. I'm actually the Koori Court Manager here in Victoria, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respect, because I am a visitor to Melbourne. I am actually from a Bangarang woman from Shepparton, Victoria. I want to thank the panel, Baz, Deb, and everyone on the panel, because what your passion obviously is very clear, and it's really, for me as a manager of Koori Courts, inspiring to be able to see that we are just a little drop in the ocean in terms of the program that we actually are working in, but that there is a global movement of people actually saying that we need to make a change in this area for Aboriginal people, and I say Aboriginal people, and I know that some people say Indigenous, but for some of us, it's actually offensive to use the word Indigenous. It's more actually appropriate to call us Aboriginal or to call us Koori people. But I just wanted to actually say, in terms of, and I have to actually say this as a Victorian Aboriginal woman sitting in this room tonight and pay respect to you guys, but to acknowledge that Victoria has a program that Baz was able to come and see today, and I encourage you lawyers, up-and-coming lawyers, to come and sit in Koori Court and actually have a look at it, because it is a very different model, and it's based on cultural values and respect of our elders in Victoria, and that's what makes the difference. It's a significant point of difference around this model of talking to your elders and to uphold the values of your community through your elders. So the conversation is very, very different. And when our Aboriginal mob, and I struggle to say offenders and I struggle to say accused, because they're people, and they're our people. They're our brothers, sisters, uncles, aunties. They're our mothers, and so when you talk about incarceration in this country and the fact that it's actually 28% at the moment, it's sitting significantly high. And, back in 2002, when we set up the very first Koori Court in Shepparton, we did that because our Aboriginal people didn't have a voice in the justice system in this state. And it was locking up our mob at alarming rates, and they were dying. But what I want to actually encourage you today is, if you're looking at reinvesting, if you're talking about reinvestment into the justice system, what we need to be looking at is, how do we reinvestigate money or you know what I mean, I'll put my teeth back in. We need to reinvest our money into services, and we talked about, and the young girl talked about ACCHOs, the fact that we have Aboriginal organisations that are running on the smell of an oily rag in this country, that there needs to be more reinvestment of funding into that, so we can actually refer and divert, and we talk about diversion programs, but we need really strong referral pathways in this country that support people who want to make a difference, because to come to Koori Court you have to have pled guilty, and the reason they plead guilty to sit before their elders, and it's no soft sentencing option, it's a really tough thing. Just imagine going to your grandmother and sitting before her and telling her you did wrong, and the disappointment in her face, and that's what it's like to sit before your elders, to actually feel that. So when you think about it, it's a soft sentencing option. It is definitely not. It's one of the toughest things you can do because of the cultural connection. But what I want to actually say is that we need to reinvest more money into our Aboriginal organisations and to organisations that actually support Aboriginal people on the ground, because it's not working. What we're doing, if we look at that referral pathways, we're literally just having a revolving door of our mob coming through and going into prisons, coming out and going back into prisons. So we need to change that. So when we talk about this reinvestment of money and changing and abolishing prisons, I absolutely agree we should be abolishing prisons. I don't know whether I should have said that with this.
All right.
Actually,
that was the last one, and can we thank the panel? And I just want to thank you for all coming and take away from this what most of the panel is pushing in regards to the issues facing in this country, particularly Indigenous incarceration. Thank you.